Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, as the general election campaign has finally begun and we can throw up all the polls in the bin, I'd like to discuss how people think the polling usually behaves during a general election campaign and how it actually behaves based on the last 8 general elections. So what is the assumption that keeps flying about? It's that the polls will narrow in favour of the incumbent government, the Conservatives, which is both a genuine expectation as well as being a bit wide of the mark. Confused? I'll explain. First of all, why do people think that the polls are likely to narrow? Well, there are good reasons. When people are answering voting intention polls in between elections, it's a largely abstract affair. It takes an election isn't happening, so people don't feel that they're making a particularly weighty decision, and you don't have the daily campaigning being rammed down their throats. Opposition parties often benefit because people feel that the government is failing in some important area of their life. Nothing's ever going to be brilliant. And the opposition are promoting policies that sound brilliant. And you think, oh yeah, that would make things better. And you assume the opposition will do everything else well as well. They'll just make these things better. But once the general election campaign begins, then there is going to be an election. The decision you're going to make now carries weight because it's no longer abstract. Your vote is going to form part of the calculation for who gets to run the country for the next 5 years. Under these circumstances, it is common for the incumbent government to benefit. People think to themselves, well, the opposition sounds like it's got some good ideas, but can they carry them all out? What if they're incompetent? You know, they've not been tested in practice. I mean, I'm not starving. I don't have to pull out my own teeth with pliers. So life's not too bad. Better the devil you know. I will vote to keep things as they are because I'm sort of coping. So if the government go into the election behind, this has the effect of narrowing the polls, even if they ultimately lose. But what happens if life actually is really bad under the current government? What if you are struggling to feed your family? What if you are having to pull out teeth with pliers? What if it's not all right? Bear in mind that even people whose incomes sort of insulates them from the worst of the Tory government, there are still privations. The raw sewage on the beach and in rivers, that is negatively impacting the standard of living of even well-off voters. Their money doesn't stop that. The lack of dentists and GP appointments means even if you're okay for money, you're losing that extra money on having to pay for private consultations, maybe treatment. And the signs so far are that the Conservatives are not running an effective campaign either. The first couple of days has been full of gaffes and the sort of fuel that will power the meme machine for years. Also, people overstate the extent to which polls move during general election campaigns. Mostly not at all. There have been some elections where there's been significant movement. 1992, huge amount of movement, but that was widely regarded as being down to a polling error, not a genuine shift in voter attitudes. There was a genuine significant narrow of the polls at the following election in favour of the Conservative government in 1997, but people then felt that the Conservatives were doing all right on some areas. They, for example, thought the economy was doing all right. You know, the Conservatives were winning on some policy areas, but the current Conservative government have got no hiding place. Public opinion is that Labour beat the Tories on absolutely every policy area. Another thing to point out before I look at other elections, there is this obsessive focus on, when we say the polling gap, we mean the polling gap between Labour and the Conservatives. And it's not just that that gap is a national gap and doesn't tell the full story about what's going to happen on a constituency by constituency basis in a country that uses first past the post. Remember, a party that can win, say, 40% of the vote, but it's spread out everywhere, isn't going to win as many seats as a party with 40% of the vote that has concentrated that vote in the seats that they can realistically win. And, you know, we saw this in 2005. Labour got, you know, just over a third of all the votes and the Conservatives got just under a third of all the votes, yet Labour won way more seats. They got a significant majority, a decent majority, in fact. And the Conservatives had a terrible, they had a worse result than Labour in 2019. But the other thing to point out is Yes, the gap still matters for some things. And yes, the gap between Labour and the Conservatives still matters. But the Conservatives are competing for a lot of their seats with the Lib Dems. It's not just Labour. If the Lib Dems improve their rating in those marginal seats that they're challenging the Tories in, that is as serious an issue as the gap with Labour. In 2001, if we start going on the elections again, there was no narrowing of the gap at all. In fact, the gap actually widened in the Labour government's favour. But the final results were closer. Remember, back then, for a lot of local elections, general elections until recently, there's always been errors in the polling. Polling has improved a lot since then. But it has generally in the past favoured Labour. But there are lots of difficult variables for pollsters to take account of. You know, they do look at it. They do improve the model each time. And there are extra difficulties this year. 2005, nothing much changed at all. Again, it ebbed and flowed, but Labour went into the election 6 points ahead and was 6 points ahead on the final day before the election. So, you know, again, another election with not much movement. In 2010, Labour technically had a small poll lead, a tiny poll lead really, of like 1 point over the Conservatives, and the Conservatives ended up winning, but not enough to form a majority. In 2015, Labour began with a tiny lead again. They finished the pre-election polls on no overall lead at all, but then the Tories won significantly more votes than Labour. Again, the polls were favouring Labour. They often did for a very long time for some reason. The actual voting intention polls showed no real movement at all, though. So the actual polls didn't really change. In 2017, they did. The poll gap famously narrowed as Theresa May made an arse of her election campaign. This was a very real narrowing of the polls, but that was down to the fact the Tories ran a nightmare campaign. And Labour were pretty solid. They stuck to the script. They didn't trip up on any major way. So emphasising the quality of the campaign also matters. So looking at the current election, you would think the Tories are going to struggle to present the most professional campaign with the tools they have to work with. Then in 2019, the last election, the polls again hardly moved at all. There was a slight narrowing, not very much. It was certainly not enough to stop the Conservatives winning a large majority, which is what they were polling to do at the start of the campaign. And the thing about the last two elections is, you know, one of the reasons why I pay very careful attention to particularly YouGov polls, I look at a lot of them. YouGov rose to prominence in 2017 by basically getting their results almost spot on in terms of the distribution of votes, but also their MRP polling. In previous elections, even the polls taking place just before the election often, for whatever reason, were flattering Labour. But in 2017, 2019, the YouGov polling was very close to the actual results in terms of the percentage of the votes won. So that is why I pay a lot of attention to YouGov. Time will tell if this year's are as close. I'm not saying that YouTube are definitely going to score a hat-trick again. There are extra difficulties for pollsters this year, especially with boundary changes, but also Reform UK. The weird nature of Reform UK is going to create a huge error. So that'll be interesting to analyse in July. But the point is, there is no established pattern of the polls either narrowing or even favouring the incumbent always. Sometimes there is, sometimes there's good reason why the incumbent benefits during a general election campaign as voters get cold feet about changing it. It is possible, you know, the better the devil you know thinking is real on the part of some voters, but it is not always there. If you look at the past general elections, you do not always see it. You would also say the effect is likely to be less pronounced if the government really is failing on all measures and if the government are running a really bad campaign. And, you know, I could point out there have been a couple of polls out since the general election announcement. One showed a small narrowing of the gap. One showed a widening of the gap. But in reality, nothing is likely to change much for most of the campaign anyway. The general election campaign mostly is trying to influence the people who don't pay much attention to politics, but who will vote, who think it's important to vote. And most of these people will be making their minds up very close to polling day at all if they haven't already. So in a way, yes, I'm going to be poring over every credible poll which is published, especially large-scale MRP polls. I'll be very interested in those. I also know from past election data, it is not common for very much to change until the last few days of the campaign. Basically, if a pollster wants to parade their final pre-election polls after the results are known, don't do it a week before. You're best off doing your field work like 2 days before the election itself. But there is no reason to suppose that the polls will be very different at the end of this process than before. They may do, but if it is, it will be because either Labour make a particular hash of things, or more likely, the Tories have some genuinely cunning plans like the social media dirty tricks I am anticipating. And let's not forget the quality of the campaigns from the Lib Dems and the SNP will also be crucial to end results as well. The SNP are competing with Labour for dozens of seats and the Lib Dems with the Tories for even more. Focusing on the poll gap just between the two largest parties is ignoring other major factors. So don't be caught up too much with every new poll that comes out. I will update on a weekly basis on this channel, but it won't be the most exciting feature of the election. In fact, ironically, I would say polling is less interesting in the middle of a general election campaign than outside it. It may be more interesting to more people, but it should be less interesting because polling is all you've got between election campaigns to sort of gauge public views, ways that things are going. But during the election campaign itself, those public views are being shaped by the campaign. So whenever someone releases a poll, it's straight away out of date because there's been another couple of days of campaigning going on. That being said, I am looking forward to next week's polls and I can't wait to see a large-scale MRP poll that is conducted entirely within the general election period. But the problem with that is we have to wait till that period is almost over. We're going to have to wait weeks for that. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.